Hey, welcome again and good afternoon. My name is Amy. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the New York Transit Museum. Our main location is in downtown Brooklyn. Please come and visit if you're nearby. It's in downtown Brooklyn in a decommissioned IND subway station, and we're open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Before we get started, I have a couple upcoming programs I want to tell you about. And of course, the best way to stay in the know is to sign up for our newsletter, which is bi-weekly. We've just released a bunch of tickets to our fall vintage train rides. One is using our historic low V's to Woodlawn Cemetery, which is one of my favorite rides. And we have another batch of rides on our R32 Brightliners. So right now they're on sale to members, and they'll go on sale to the general public in 2 days. We also have tickets available to our program this Thursday at the museum if you're in town. It'll look at Metro North's restored historic locomotives and many transit. In addition, we have also many transit walks in the fall. So I'm going to put some links in the chat just in case you want to look up any of those. So for this afternoon's program, if you'd like captions, you can go to either captions or the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen and click captions and then show captions. We will also have time for questions at the end of the hour, so feel free to add them to the chat and I'll share them to Mark once he's done. So now on to our event. Mark Ovenden is an author, broadcaster, and lecturer whose best-selling books focus on the design, architecture, signage, and typefaces of public transport networks. Critics say Mark brings, quote, joyful insight and accessibility, end quote, to what may appear dry or technical subjects. The New York Times called his work catnip for transit enthusiasts. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, has an MA degree in railway studies, and is a presenter of documentaries, as well as weekly radio shows and podcasts on transit. His 2 most recent books are Iconic Transit Maps from 2024, which he's talking about today, and that's available in our store. And he is also well known for, he also has a forthcoming, no, this was just published in French in 2025, a study of the Paris Metro. His book, Transit Maps of the World, is from 2007 and is also available in our shop. And I'll put links on where you can buy those books in the chat, but now I'll hand it over to Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Amy, and welcome everybody. What a great turnout from around the world by the looks of things. This is fantastic. Yes, indeed. Today we're talking about the making of iconic transit maps. And I have a sort of a subtitle for this talk as well. I'd like to call it How Good Design Helps Riders. We call them passengers over here, so if I say that now and again, please excuse me. But that's the area we're going to. So what are iconic transit maps? We're going to talk about my fascination, how mass transit arrived, various different landmarks along the way, but I've got a little quiz for you before we start, just to have a think about what an iconic map really means. So if I put up these little thumbnails, I can't hear you shout back at the screen, but I think you're probably going to know where they're from. Let's have a look. Here's the first one, a little tiny thumbnail of one city. A thumbnail of another city. You getting the gist of this? Do you know where these places are? You might know this one if you're local to Amy. And here's another one from over here in Europe. The iconography of a transit map is now really, really well known, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So where does somebody get an interest in transit maps? Kind of odd, I suppose. Hopefully some of you have got a similar interest, and maybe some of you also designed maps when you were a kid. I'm going to show you some of my really terrible maps that I designed when I was a kid, and it led to, when I was at school, me trying to reinterpret the famous London Underground map. The result was an absolute mess, I admit. I'm so sorry, it's so terrible, but it got me a place at art college where I was able to study the subject in a little bit more detail. Now, after I left art college, I got involved in mad things like music and TV and broadcasting. As Amy said, I've been around the world, so to speak, but I always kept up my collection of transit maps from around the world. And the thing that happened was that friends got to hear about my collection of transit maps and they would say, "Hey, Mark, we're going off to Barcelona today. Lend us your map." This was all before the internet. And of course, it would come back with coffee stains on it and all rolled around the edges. I mean, oh, my lovely collection. Why isn't there a book about transit maps? So I thought, well, if there isn't one, maybe I should just try and create one. And to begin with, I tried to figure out how I would then present this idea of all the cities with transit maps. And so I drew a kind of an approximation, rough, playful idea of the London Underground and how the different map cities of the world would fit on that idea of a map. That was then redrawn for me by the guy who actually looked after the London Transport Map, a guy called Alan Fole, a brilliant designer. And this was what he helped me produce. And that ended up on the cover of my first book in 2003, which in the UK was called Metro Maps of the World. That was picked up by the wonderful Penguin in New York, and that was released, as Amy said, in 2007 as Transit Maps of the World. And I've been doing them ever since. Don't do so much media now, but do books. And as Amy kindly said, my most recent book is called Iconic Transit Map. So that's where this nutty guy gets his ideas from. Okay, let's go back to a bit of history. I don't know whether you know this, but the first mass transit system in the world was the Metropolitan Railway in London. And this is one of the very early maps. It's an engineer's map from 1859, so before it was built. And it really wasn't intended for riders. It was really there as a way of promoting the line. When we had the opening of the Chicago L, the maps that were produced there were very, very geographic. Why would they not do that? They were trying to show people where the L went to. And the same is true of places like Paris when it opened the metro in 1900. This is a very, very geographic map. Again, not necessarily intended for riders, but as a piece of information about where the metro ran to. Same is true of Boston when that opened its little subway in 1901. This really was more for engineers to put up on the wall so they knew where the line went. These things weren't really intended as passenger information. And I rather like this wonderful, it doesn't sort of matter which way around you turn it map from New York, which showed where the early subways went in New York when they opened in 1904. And right through, as new subways opened around the world, they were generally pretty geographic. This is Madrid from 1919. So what happened after that? Well, the networks got messier and therefore trying to map them became more of a task. And as the networks got messier and the networks got more complex, the maps got a bit messier, so sometimes did some creative ideas come out. I love this little fold out from London. It's only about this big, it's absolutely tiny, but it is actually showing a few good ideas. I'm going to use my cursor here, if I can, to show that the transfer stations were shown with these bigger circles, and between them you'll see these little tiny weeny white line connectors, we call them in cartography, and those are still used to this day. So that idea goes right back to 1910. Let's have a look at what they were doing in Paris about 13 years after the system opened. Well, you've got a rather a messy geographic map here, but look at this great idea they were putting around the side. Little line maps to help people find their way. These obviously were very schematic. Even in New York, the BMT was producing quite interesting, well, effectively schematics. Look how they've straightened up the angle of Manhattan. It doesn't really run north-south like that. Look how they've added colours for the elevators and the subways and how they've fairly well equalised the stations. There's a good lot of thought going into some of these earlier maps. Now, as we got more complicated, there were more interesting design issues that happened. So the London Underground, for example, wanted to show what one line looked like, or one set of lines looked like inside the actual cars. And there wasn't much room to display these. They only had a little space above the doors or above the windows. And so they invented a way of showing the whole of one line in one long, thin strip, one long, thin schematic. And clearly this isn't geographic in any way, shape or form, but it was understood by the passengers. I rather like this one here from Paris. It's hidden just behind my, yeah, there he is there on the right hand side. This was made from enamel. And here you have these little panels that were actually on the doors, right by the little handles that open the doors. And these were a guide to the line that you were on. So each carriage, and each line had their own tiny internal panel map made out of enamels. Not so practical, because when they opened new extensions or they changed things, they'd take them all off and it was very expensive. But they did invent an idea in Hamburg in the early 1915, 1920s, which was to paint the map on the ceiling. Yes, we are looking at the ceiling of the inside of a car here. And look what they've done. Very interestingly, they've turned the circle line into a proper geometric circle. A nice idea from Hamburg, but of course, if you were trying to find your station, you might walk out and bump yourself into the doors. Taking geometry to a new dimension, we found a really interesting map from Berlin, and it's thought to date to probably 1929, possibly 1930. But here you have that geometric circle again, and the introduction of a single angle at 45 degrees to show the S-Bahn, that's kind of like a heavy commuter line around the edge of Berlin. Another designer based in the UK who was trying to simplify a map was a guy called George Dow. And this is one of his diagrams for a series of routes from the London North Eastern Railway. So ideas were definitely coming about at this period. Now, generally speaking, the benchmark that a lot of transit fans think about as the map that sort of started transit map design, we've seen there were a few before, but the one for London is kind of thought of that. What happened before that happened was that there were these beautiful maps produced in 1925 by a guy called F.H. Stingemore. I've got one here. Look, it's absolutely tiny, tiny little thing. Beautiful though, and it's all linen backed and with lovely colours. There's no surface geography. The only thing that's shown on the surface is the river. Really lovely idea, but very crunched up in the middle. So a gentleman by the name of Henry or Harry Beck decided he could do a little bit better. He decided to try and spread things out, introduce geometry, and see if he can turn the complicated London Underground into a diagram. And he used a few basic ideas. He smoothed out the lines so they weren't kinky. He straightened them out, and there's a lovely big trajectory through the middle of London there, this red line, the central line that draws the eye into the centre. He simplified the look of the map. He stretched the central area, squashed the suburbs, and spaced out the stations. I call it his successes or his successes. And this was all brought together in a finished colour visual in 1931, which he presented to London Transport. First, they rejected it, which was quite fun. And then finally, in 1933, they decided they would bring it out. And this really is a thing of aesthetic beauty and incredibly practical. You don't really need to know where the kinks in the line are in order to follow it. You can follow it fairly easily on a bumpy old train, or if it's put up on a wall, you can run your finger along, find where your stations are. The interchanges are shown very clearly with these lovely diamond shapes. It was a really clever piece of design. In fact, I call it a bit of an icon. Now, I know the word icon is incredibly overused, but I'm going to try and show you why it's justified. Beck himself was in charge of the London Underground diagram for about 30, 40 years, and he did fiddle around with it a little bit, and we'll see a couple of his iterations. This is him playing with a 60-degree angle rather than a 45-degree angle. By the 1960s, new hands came in and thought that they could do a bit better. And I skipped ahead a bit there, and they thought that they could actually simplify the map. Unfortunately, it was a bit scary and a bit angled, so that was eventually healed a couple of years later. But you know, this original idea by Harry Beck is still in use today. Even though we've added 6 new lines quite recently, it's still the basic idea. A little bit jumbled, a little bit messy. People say it could be improved, but the basic idea from Beck is definitely there. And talk about it being an icon. There was a BBC competition to find a design icon on the Culture Show in 2006. And the top 3 finalists were the Concorde, the Spitfire plane, and Harry Beck's tube map. So it definitely is achieving iconic status. So much so that it was actually used inside British passports as one of those pages you stamp your passes on. So definitely has some iconic value to it. It was even used as the graphics or the iconography on a set of coins issued for the Underground's 150th anniversary. And pretty quickly, we had people trying to copy the London Underground map. So this is a map from Sydney in 1939. Very much of this is not underground, just a very tiny piece in the centre is underground. But they thought, hey, it's a good idea. They even borrowed the cover of the London Underground map from a few years before. No such thing as copyright, plagiarism was rife. So in a way, it was a kind of flattery. But that was already happening. So this is a very, very unusual poster from 1935, just 2 years after Beck's first map. And as you can see, they've used a kind of a pastiche of the Beck map. It's not even the same as the Beck map, but they've used a pastiche of it to say, this is the map of the underground. Here's an idea about where you can go and do your shopping. Clever ideas showed that Beck's ideas were getting into the public domain. Let's have a look how they were doing elsewhere. Well, over in New York, we hadn't quite got to that stage yet. This is a lovely map from 1942, but it's quite big and unwieldy. It's got brilliant colours on it. It's fairly good to read, but it does get a bit cluttered in the centre here. And so in 1958, a designer by the name of George Salomon was commissioned to do something about that map. Now, the Board of Transportation that came in 1948, they were issuing joint maps anyway, but they were sticking to similar ideas than had before. George Salomon decided he would break that completely, and he came up with a schematic diagram. We know that he was kind of inspired by the map in London, and it certainly did simplify the New York subway system, which up until that stage was, as we know, a little bit more complicated to use. And this tried to simplify it a little bit. So we'll look a bit more about New York's progress in a second, but certainly they did adopt a diagram in 1958. Let's have a look at a few other cities. So Moscow was expanding its system in the 1950s, and they were not using a diagram at that point. They only had the 4 lines, and it perhaps didn't really need much more than that, but they have got rid of all the surface topography, and it wasn't really a bad idea. I love the big M in the background, it's very stylish. By the 1970s, they'd really taken some serious psychedelic substances, I think, and produced this really interesting idea. But they have got the concept of turning the circle line into a geometric circle, and the lines that run across it at multiple angles certainly improve their clarity. But it wasn't really until the 1980s that they introduced a 45-degree angle to all the lines. So they were catching up, if you like, slowly. Switching over to Tokyo, this is actually a very rare English language map from 1960, I think it is, showing a couple, there's 2 operators there. This shows that one of the operators' lines, but as you can see, it's very geographic. Just 2 years later, though, they developed their own diagram. And since then, Tokyo has used quite a lot of diagrams. This is one from the 1970s, where again, they've borrowed that look of Beck of the 45-degree angles. So they were catching up, if you like, over there. There were certain cities where it was a bit of a case of 2 steps forward and 1 steps back. This is an absolutely beautiful rendition. It's almost like a hybrid map. It's got quite a lot of surface features there, all those beautiful Berlin water features, and some roads marked on it as well, amazingly. And the circle line, the geometric circle, has been widened up into an oval for the S-Bahn, but the rest of it's quite a straightforward diagram. Lovely, worked really well in 1934, but didn't last long. That was really the only outing for it. By the time at the end of the war and Berlin had been split in 2, design had, well, they probably had a lot more important things to do than think about design, but certainly things have gone a bit backward, which is a bit of a shame. And we'll have another look at what happened to Berlin in a second. Here's Madrid from 1945. So they've kept that idea of the geography, but look, they've all introduced a new idea on the bottom here. And these were only really found in Spain, in Madrid and Barcelona. They're called thermometer diagrams, which is beautiful, and they actually do work. Here is the transfer station at Sol, and you can see it does all link together. Of course, this wouldn't work as the system got more and more complicated, but it was a very lovely, very sort of beautiful Iberian concept. Later, they went back to using geographic maps, and that, of course, was perhaps a little bit more difficult to read, although very, very handy if you need to know where the nearest station is geographically. Another city that didn't really embrace diagrams straight away was wonderful Paris. Now, this was the F. Legout design from 1937. No surface geography, kind of clear, just the river present, This little thing in the center there is the exhibition center around the Eiffel Tower, but there's a very multiple angles going on, and they haven't really attempted to sort of straighten up all the lines. It lasted a long time, right into the 60s and almost the 70s. This was an attempt to change it and improve it by Patrice Rouxel in 1978. Didn't really massively change things. I do love his transfer stations, by the way. It's almost like looking down a big hole into the center of Châtelet to see, that's where my lines cross. They're quite fun. But they did introduce some degree of schematicization for these RER lines around the edge. So it's not as if they didn't know how to do a diagram, but it took them a bit longer to catch up. Here's another city that was proposed to be more of a diagram. This was designed by Lawrence Wyman in 1970. He's the guy that designed the pictograms for each station to help those people who had problems reading English language names. Unfortunately, the operator didn't go with this idea and introduced a very geographic map, which lasted really only until the last couple of years, when it was redesigned by a young designer who was absolutely brilliant. And unfortunately, this has always been a little bit sort of more scrappy and not so aesthetically beautiful. You couldn't really call it an icon of Mexico City. Now, there was another great city which introduced a new system in the 1970s, wonderful San Francisco. They started off with diagrams, not a bad idea, that famous sort of X shape, and that eventually was evolved into a geographic map, which some people will argue is perhaps a little bit unnecessary to show all the curvy-wurvy routes all the way up to Dublin Pleasanton. But anyway, they stuck with that for a while. They've also come back into the fold recently with some nice diagrams. So it makes you wonder whether it wouldn't just be easier if everybody used a diagram and everybody used the same kind of ideas. Well, one guy has tried to do this. He's a brilliant designer by the name of Hugh Serovic, and he has basically come up with a system to make a very similar, very similar design for each city. We'll try and scroll through some of these, but as you can see, he's really using similar or identical principles really for every single city. Now, Hugh is a very clever guy. He's done about 40 or 50 of these. They all do look very similar. It's very easy for a tourist to find the way around using one of his maps. And he bases this on a system of using the same symbols for stations where the train stops, stations where it doesn't stop, terminals, transfer stations, different colors, the same symbol for airports and train transfers and buses. And he also uses the similar type of line for each one. But he himself recognizes that that would be a bit dull if every city looked exactly the same. So he tries to analyze what is in the city. And this is his one from Delhi. I don't know if you can see that he's worked out that there are sort of two centers of Delhi, interestingly, of course, called Old Delhi and New Delhi. And he then tried to accommodate that special feature in the design for the Delhi map. And this is his final work for that. It's a very lovely, very aesthetically balanced diagram and looks just like the other ones, but maybe that is the problem. Maybe the problem with Hugh's idea, and he admits this himself, is that we maybe lose a little bit of that individuality for each city to make those maps iconic. But there are other designers. For example, there's a brilliant Russian guy by the name of Ilya Berman who understands that each city is different and that there are skip stops on certain systems and restricted services and fares and zones and terminals. Everything's a little bit different in each city. And in order to address this problem, he did a very thorough forensic examination of the interchanges in Moscow. Now, I don't know if any of you have been. I wish I had. It's a beautiful looking system. But every single station at a transfer, most of them anyway, have a different name, which kind of makes it a bit difficult. So you have to show all the different names at every transfer. So he experimented with how you could show the names. And while he was doing this, the Moscow authorities decided that they would also have to show not just the Cyrillic Russian alphabet, but also like a Western alphabet too, underneath every name, just to complicate things a little bit more. And eventually he worked hard at this. He realized that some of these ideas will work better than others. This idea, for example, meant that there were crossovers where they weren't really in real life. Eventually he solved that idea to make the crossovers appear in the right place and he solved that with what he calls the double diamond. And it's a very clever, simple idea. You can see he's used the gradient of each line color to gradually fill into the next line. And look, there are those white line connectors, by the way, which we see on many metro maps that we saw back in London in 1910. So history repeats itself. And from that lovely interchange symbol, he then built the entire map from that one interchange. So it just goes to show that studying designs do end up leading to really nice iconic maps. Now, I want to have a look at a couple of case studies in terms of looking at iconic maps. And stay with me on this, because please ask lots of questions about it afterwards. But we saw the George Salomon map from 1958. Another brilliant designer called Raleigh Didamo came in 1967, standing on the shoulders, really, of George Salomon, and he introduced much more colour. So we've got the waterways in a nice blue, which was a bit more user-friendly. You've still got a lot of distortion in the island of Manhattan. Any of you that know it will know it's much longer and thinner and lies at that angle, but it seems to be a little easier to use. Raleigh could have been the real hero of map design in New York, but in the 60s as well, New York was introducing new signage by the Unimark company, and one of the people who were part of Unimark was a designer called Massimo Vinelli. He asked a colleague of his, Joan Charasin, to help him to design a new schematic for the New York subway system. I'm sure a lot of you will recognize this next slide because it's become a design classic, introduced in 1972. Extremely well balanced and very clever. Lots of criticism of it because of the wrong color of the waterways, and some of the junctions are in the wrong place. And eventually a committee was set up under John Toranak to design a new map, and that was worked on by Nobu Sarasi and Mike Hertz, and they come up with a revised map in 1979. This is a sketch from Nobu that showed what he was going to do in the very, very complicated junction at Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, and I think you know where this is going. That was eventually introduced as the full map in 1979. So in a way, New York had moved back away from pure schematics, but it was powerful and it lasted many years. It still can be seen nowadays. And there was a remix of it in 1998 by Gordania, Hertz and Joseph, which again was a big improvement. And this has definitely become an iconic map of New York. We'll see a few iconic souvenirs of that later on. Now, there's always been this discussion as to whether or not there could be a return to some kind of diagram. And in the last few years, Steve Flam and his team have worked to try and figure out whether that could be done. They did a few test runs, which we'll see in a second. But as you probably know, if you live in New York, this was introduced in 2023, 2024. And I know that it's issued to the public because I've got my own copy here, and that folds out into a lovely diagram. So that's a diagram coming back to New York. So case study number one. What was happening over in Tokyo? Well, one of the operators, the TRTA, had slipped back into using geographic maps. And a young designer by the name of Kanji Onishi, he didn't think that was a good idea. And he thought he could come up with a better idea. And he submitted it to the TRTA and they said, oh, okay, well, let's try and do it. And this was his idea. Extremely beautiful in its own right, I think. Maybe a bit confusing to some eyes who are perhaps not used to some of the beautiful Japanese lettering, but he's put the names of the stations inside the station markers, which is very clever. There's no surface geography at all apart from the park in the central area here, and changed to an oval shape. And as you can see, he's kind of echoed the oval around with this kind of circular line, not quite circular line, that goes around the edge of the inner area. And this is still in use today and has definitely become a bit of an icon for maps in Japan. Going over to Paris, well, our old friend Patrice Rouxel thought, well, you know, maybe I should try this diagrammatic idea. It's very English, but I'll give it a go. So he did come up with this lovely design in 1984. It wasn't so much liked, actually, by the Parisians. And when a new designer came in by the name of Yoko Minagai in 1992, they tried to work out a way of keeping some elements of a diagram and yet allowing the kind of tilt of Paris to come back. This is what they produced, and it did last quite a long time, at least about 8 or 9 years. In fact, it is actually still a diagram. If you tilt your head to the right hand side and look at the screen, you'll see that the lines, the RER lines and the line one, are perpendicular. But obviously there are multiple angles as well as having 45 degrees. But it lasted quite a long time and it definitely became iconic for Paris. But eventually they had to do something different, and in the year 2000 a new diagram was introduced for Paris by BDC Conseil, a design agency, and this has now become the official metro map of Paris. And it's definitely returning to the roots of the benchmark maps and some of the early diagrams, but some people don't love it, some people think it can be improved, but I think it's quite a good response to the problems there. I said we'd have another look at Berlin. Well, you know that the city was divided into east and west, and the underground ran underneath East Berlin. This is East Berlin here, and most of the underground was in West Berlin, so they had to try and show that on some of the maps. And if you look at the 65 map, you'll see that there are crosses through some of the stations here where the train was not allowed to stop. So you would get on here and you'd literally run underneath central Berlin, and you couldn't get on or off until you got back into West Berlin. A divided city. Very, very sad that that happened, but we know where it was going. The East Berliners had their own funky graphic design. They had most of the S-Bahn, and they produced some quite interesting ideas. I really quite like this one from 1980, where they've introduced a lot more colour. And this actually reminds me of some of the Massimo Vignelli ones where he bunched the lines together. It's quite nice, but in multiple colours. Wasn't to last long though, because in 1989 things were about to change, but not before the East Berliners got in one last graphic design trick. Look here, this isn't really a complete line, but they're trying to show it as a circle. This is the East Berlin map, and where's West Berlin? Oh dear, it's been slightly reduced to this minute little slither down the middle. This is a case of graphic designers trying to, well, fib really by trying to pretend something's not there. It does happen a lot in maps, but thankfully the city was reunited in 1989 when the wall came down, and they tried to piece together the network and piece together the map. By 1990, Eric Spiekermann was involved in the 1990s, and many more of the stations that had been closed for years had been opened. And if you look at this tiny little arm here of the S-Bahn lines, you'll see what Spiekermann was going to try and do to the centre of Berlin as the whole of that line was about to open around the edge. He turned it into this beautiful sort of hexagon shape, which is really lovely, and that really corrals the eye into the middle and deals nicely with the zoning, and is a really beautiful map. Definitely an icon of German transit maps. I mentioned that Madrid had gone a little bit geographic. Well, it did have a diagonal phase in 1970. We don't actually know if this was an official map or not, but they have found this one in the archives. It's a rather quirky, interesting idea. But by 1980, they had decided to renovate the stations, and the designer Arcadi Moradel, he introduced the new typeface Helvetica for all the stations, and obviously designed a new metro map for Madrid. The thing is, though, that as they were expanding the system, and they'd done a lot of expansions in Madrid, they opened this enormous big loop down in the southwest, and that forced the rest of the map over into this kind of oblong shape in order to fit the new Metro Sur in. But this wasn't particularly feeling happy for the designers of the metro, so they commissioned a new designer by the name of Rafa Sanudo to come up with a brand new idea. And this was his concept in 2007. He's abolished curves and diagonals. What a crazy dude. And is it an improvement? Well, I kind of think it's quite clever. There's that Metro Sur, the little loop in the southwest, and it all seems to fit in quite nicely. But I have to tell you, it wasn't sort of universally popular, and eventually it was wrested back. The design was wrested back from Rafa, and the older, more schematic style was reintroduced by Miguel, who is a really good designer who works for the Madrid Metro, and the original shape is still there. They've managed to fit the Metro Sur in a kind of portrait shape, and it sticks on the cars on this lovely big sticker, which is become very iconic for maps in Madrid. Now, we're talking about schematics, and they do distort things, but can there be a few distortions that go a bit too far? Well, I think maybe there are. So this is a map of Moscow, a schematic from Moscow from 1980. Did you ever play that game Kaplunk when you were a kid? You know that thing where you pull the sticks out and the marbles all fall down, and then if you know the game I mean. This kind of reminds me of that. Like you're looking down the turret of Kaplunk, and in the middle there are all these lovely multicolored marbles. It's a bit crazy. But they have introduced one idea which is quite nice. They've removed the line between the stations here. I call it kind of beading of the stations. And it's quite a clever idea because maybe you don't need to know the trajectory of the line, but eventually people in the solars did need to know the trajectory of the line, so that was kind of phased out. Here's another distortion from that Ilya Berman chap we saw earlier on. This is even more funky. Can you get your head around that? Imagine if that was your subway system. He assures me that these lines that run in between the lines do actually work as transfers, but I've never been, so I can't attest to it. But I think that's a bit of a distortion too far. So that has not become an iconic map. And here's another fantastically crazy idea by Andrew Bossy of how to change the Washington Metro. He also thinks or tells me that this works. So if there's anyone here from Washington watching, at Potomac Station, does the blue, orange, silver line all stop there? You can tell me in the chat afterwards. It's a lovely idea, but it was never going to become the official map of the system. And then there are wonderful designers like Kim Ji-won from Seoul who make fantastic designs. This one obviously for New York. This one coming up is for Amsterdam, based on a tulip. And wait till you see his Paris Metro map. Here it comes. He's fitted the whole of the Paris Metro system into an Eiffel Tower shape. Well, these things are absolutely beautiful, but and great exercises in design. But as you probably have guessed, they haven't been adopted by the authorities. One idea that does seem to be catching on a little bit is doing concentric circles. Now, we saw the geometric map of Berlin from 1929. Here's one from Paris from 1936. It wasn't an official map. This is definitely done by a private organization, and it's quite difficult to find your way to the station names. They all appear at kind of strange angles, but it was a very brave idea, and I kind of liked it. So well done to the private company that made that in 1936. Fast forward to the 21st century, and there's a designer called Max Roberts who's really making a big thing of his concentric map idea. This is his one for Berlin, as you can see, radiating out circles. Really lovely idea, and this works completely. I mean, you really can transfer at these stations, so it's a beautifully executed idea. Here's his concept for London, and he's placed the London logo, the roundel device, the underground symbol, at the centre. I don't know whether this would ever be accepted as an idea, but it certainly is an interesting way of looking at it. His ideas for Cologne have been adopted. This is the official map of Cologne, designed by Max Roberts. Concentric circles works really well. And there definitely are other people who are experimenting with concentric circles, including this guy, Constantine, who tried to do the Paris map in 2015. So it's an idea that's gaining some traction. What about squares? We saw Rafa's map earlier on. Well, even Beck himself tried to banish diagonals. There's many fewer curves and very few diagonals on this from 1959. But really, this idea of using squares, again, this is another version of the Madrid one from Rafa in 2009, a portrait version. I don't know if it's actually going to catch on, but there's some lovely art that's been produced. This is another one by Max Roberts, by the way, of London as a sort of based on Charles Rennie Mackintosh's design. So there are ideas out there that may need to be experimented with, maybe. And then we come to the hybrids. So maybe you can mix together a schematic with a geographic map. And a brilliant designer from Holland, Paul Mijenskier, he managed to do that as an experiment, really, by making the centre of London more geographic and keeping the schematics in the suburbs. It's a lovely idea, actually, really nice. And one of the greatest exponents of the hybrid map is the very fantastic Eddie Yabor, based in New York, of course, who was pretty much the first person to come up with a sort of a zoomable map where the closer you zoom in on a handheld, the more detail you get. And his kick maps are very cool and easy to use, and hats off to him for developing that concept. And there have been suggestions that we can return to hybrid maps. So if you see the S-Bahn here, it's obviously not a geometric circle, that original idea from 1929. It goes in this very, very funny shape. But the rest of the map is a diagram. So maybe we do end up having more hybrids in the future. I think it's a live debate. That was by a guy called Pashka Omelikin. But the real future, I think, is going to be in live maps, which are all driven by data. And there's a brilliant designer in Vienna called Tanya Tomkin, and she has attempted to design a map that moves but keeps all the lines where they are. So you can look at the map, it appears inside the cars, up on the walls above the doors. She's a very small piece of screen real estate to design the map for. Big job for her, and she pulled it off really, really well. And you can see that as the next stop comes closer, the map highlights where you can transfer and then where those lines lead to. If I can just whiz backwards and forwards, you can see that the baselines stay the same. And this just juggles between the different ones as you go along the route and you get to the next station. It shows you the interchanges that are to come. Really clever idea. It also shows real-time information as well. And this really is going to be the way forward, I think, as to where maps are going to. This is a trial for real-time information from Berlin. I think the trains are a bit lumpy. They might bump into each other. Oh, shush, don't say anything about that. But this was designed by a company called U-Bunchen. Lovely idea. And unfortunately, I don't have a moving version of this, which was done by another app, but it does move if you go onto their website here. And this shows you the position of the trains in the tunnels in New York City. Last thing I want to say, really, last few things I want to say is that when we're designing maps, the number one thing we mustn't forget is the rider. For goodness sake, don't forget the rider. They are so important. You can come up with a beautiful idea, but what's it going to be used like? And that's why in New York, they carried out a lot of customer research in 2021, 2023. They've done the same sort of thing in Cairo. Miriam Nada and her team have been putting up maps around the city to make sure that they can be read by people. They've done the same sort of thing in Bangkok. All over the world, they're doing this. They're using new ideas and they're testing them out with people. So I wonder what the future is going to be for iconic maps. Is it all going to be about handheld devices? Are we going to end up with using the same idea again and again and again until it's actually illegible? This is Shanghai's plans for the future. Is that going to be okay? Or do we need to do something like Jürg Serevac is talking about and introducing simplification and standardization across the world? Or will we end up going in circles? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but this is what we can talk about. What I do want to finish off with, though, is that making an iconic map, turning it into an icon, makes that the brand for the transit system. And you know you're succeeding when people are tattooing themselves with your map. I don't think I'd fancy all those colours on my little toes, but some people have tried it. So good luck to them. And of course, they've also obviously all been turned into fantastic mugs, which are on sale in the Transit Museum souvenir shop. Many mugs from around the world and the most iconic maps. And they've been turned into shower curtains. Ken Dumas's beautiful map from Boston's been turned into a towel. And again, in the Transit Museum shop, you can no doubt buy a lovely bag. But I do wonder what the original designer of all of these iconic maps would think. Good old Harry Beck, there he is there showing off his wares. If he was to know just how far people are going with souvenirs. Oh dear. Scary stuff. Thank you for listening. I write books about all this stuff. I do a program on the radio and on a podcast about it. You can have a look at me on social media. Thanks for talking to me, and do ask as many questions as you like as we go through the next session. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was fascinating. There's a lot of accolades in the chat. We have some questions. I'm also wanted to say, I'm sure there's people attending today who have Metro maps tattooed on themselves. I've seen them at our programs. I work with people who have them, so it's more common than you might think. And we do have time for questions if you haven't had a chance to add them to the chat. I have a question first, because I was thinking about, it's very rare that I actually use one of the maps in the subway stations or in a train. I usually just use my phone. So what is your feelings about digital maps? Like everything's kind of collapsed onto each other. You kind of lose all of the design, but there is design. It's just serves a lot of purposes. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and we all use phones, and we all, well, not everyone does, but most people use phones, most people use apps, and I've used apps to guide my way around subway systems. But I love to see a map on a wall or inside the carriage stuck up there. And I don't think, I've talked to a lot of transit operators around the world, I don't think we've seen the end of the paper map. I think we're still going to see paper maps produced. And if we're going to have paper maps, we're going to have good designed maps. And if you're going to do something on a mobile app, you may as well use the good design on the paper map. So I don't think there was a time actually, Amy, when we thought we would lose it, when things like Google and Apple Maps and Bing and stuff, they started showing the transit, where you're going from, where you're going to, and all you could do was bring up a geographic map. But I think we're
Yeah.
moving a little bit away from that now, hopefully, and there will still be well-designed maps, I hope.
Yeah, I'm not a little moving dot on the paper map, so it's
Yeah.
not as helpful for me. Okay, so from the audience, one thing that was somewhat answered, but I thought I'd let you take a crack at it too. So we all know the New York City system has a complicated history of lots of companies that have come together. What's the history of London Underground? Has it always been one transit system, or was it something merged?
No, in London, like a lot of other cities, we had private operators building the different lines, and it wasn't all merged together really until 1933. And before that, you had to buy separate tickets for the Metropolitan or the Circle or the District or the whatever. So we haven't always had a state-run or a city-run transit authority covering London. But since we have had that, the design has got a lot better.
Okay, and we just had another question related to London that just came in, so I'll read that one now. What do you think about the map used today for the London system? Has it had its time in that it excludes most surface lines?
Yeah, I didn't quite get all of that, but I think I think what you said is, does the tube map exclude some of the surface lines? Yes, it does. The little tube map here now, tiny little thing, and it's trying to squeeze too much on, really, I think.
What do you think
But
about that, though?
I think that the time has come for some fine tuning. Yeah, we need to, for example, all things like the zones are all shown on here, and other designers have found better ways to show the zones. We
Ooh,
show
you
all
should
the,
consult for them, Mark. You
sorry.
should, you should consult for them. You should reach out.
Oh, you're trying to give me some extra money. Thank you.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, there are a lot of people who are looking at this, and there are designers who are trying to show all the railways in London and other cities as well, because there's this thing that now that we can just use our mobile phones to touch in and touch out to pay for our transit journey, then the passenger, the rider, is becoming more and more mode blind. They don't care whether it's a streetcar or a light rail or an underground or a metro or a subway or an elevated. They just want to get on, go to their destination, get off, and they charge the lowest fare. And I think the more and more people become mode blind, it's good, and transit operators will have to design maps which show everything but don't get too cramped.
Mode blind, that's interesting. Because I feel like I've lived in New York for 20 years, but it wasn't until I started working at this museum that I thought of the subways more than just moving boxes or like buses as moving boxes. Anyway, okay, so there's a question about Japan. So how complicated was it for the Japanese government to make the metro map for Tokyo with Toei and JR both sharing ownership?
Another good question, and a similar one to how many operators are there in each city. So not only are the Tokyo Metro and the city both running subway lines in Tokyo, but there are also lots of JR lines, and there are many commuter and suburban lines. There's a lot of railways in Tokyo. My God, it's in a big metropolitan area, 38 million people. There's a lot to show on a map. And I think they've done a lot better in the last few years. They are working together more than they did previously. And I do think that Kanji, who we showed his map, is one of those who's contributed to that. And there are people from both the operators are trying to work together. They still produce their own maps, and they are both a little bit different, but they do at least show all the metro systems in the city, which is more than they used to do. So there's progress there. But there are places like Seoul, which has several different operators, and some of those are state owned and some of those are private run. They've done a lot recently. They recently employed young designers to redo their whole metro map, and similar things are happening in places like Singapore, which are employing young designers to do things. So we need to encourage more people like you people watching to get your pencils out or your computer out and design new subway maps or transit maps, hopefully ones which are integrated so we can be mode blind and travel from one to the other. How do we get all those systems on one single map? How do you include buses on them? That's really tricky.
Well, you know a lot, Mark. So for Shanghai, being so large and complex, how would you split it up or simplify it? Maybe a big overview, then small detail sections or quadrants? I'm unfamiliar with the city, so I'm not sure how to reconcile the size.
Mm, mm. It's the biggest or the second biggest subway system in the world, going from just one little line 30 years ago. It's absolutely vast. Beijing is the other one. They've got 1,000 kilometers of track, amazing expansion. And as I showed at one of the end slides there, if you just use the traditional schematic, your benchmark, your 45-degree angles, how are you going to make that legible when you've got 27 different lines and they all have their own colors? How are you going to make that work for people who've got limited vision? So I don't know the answer yet. If I did, I would be a very well-paid consultant and probably would have jetted over to be sitting right next to you right now, Amy. But unfortunately, I just write books about it. I'm just a commentator, and I don't know the answer for someone like Shanghai, but it's incredibly complicated system and something has to give somewhere.
Think I'm going to lose my train card if I haven't lost it already, but New York is the most stations or
Yes,
okay.
stations, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
New
So
York.
I'm sure that creates complicated map too. Let someone just add, what do you think? Like, do you think the path in New Jersey Transit should be included in the NYC diagram, even though they aren't MTA operations?
Absolutely. Come on, guys. You're just next door to each other. You may be different states, but please work together. Lots of people live in New Jersey and want to get into New York or want to come from Manhattan and go into New Jersey. Work together, put them both on there. The MTA did a really good map, actually, a diagram for the Super Bowl. Was it in 2014? Where they showed all the transit going from Manhattan into New Jersey and backwards and forwards. And it was a really nice design. I put it in one of my updates of Transit Maps of the World. So we can work together. Let's work together with everyone and make it easy for people, make it easy for riders.
So we've had a lot of questions about paper copies of maps, which I think just generally, especially since the pandemic, you can't find paper anything. I feel like there's just always QR codes whenever I go to restaurants now. But do you know of any cities that are still like prioritizing the paper copy of the map to hand out?
Well, I got this one in 2024. It's paper. Hello. Well done, New York. No, it's a brilliant question. There were definitely some cities that had tried to move away from paper. I think it was Stockholm, and you could not find a map in a station. You couldn't find the actual well-designed map on their website. You're like, hey, where is it? It was all about, I want to go from here to there and show me a path and a moving dot on the map, as you said, Amy. So unfortunately, that has been explored, and I think it is still a bit difficult in some cities to find a paper map, but people are beginning to realize that not everyone uses mobile phones. Some of our seniors don't use mobile phones, and some kids don't have mobile phones. So maybe we should still be doing paper maps and giving them away at stations to help everyone.
Okay, so oh, one thing I also wanted to mention when you asked the chat if anyone from San Francisco could verify all those locations from that one line. I can't recreate the question. I didn't write down your question, but they said yes. That's
Good.
helpful.
I think it
Thank
was
you.
Washington. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Amtrak has eliminated maps and schedules for their trains and no longer publishes a national system map, only an online trip planner. What is your opinion of this? Are there advantages?
It's sad. Come on, Amtrak. We want more people using the trains. Get them out of their private vehicles and get them onto the trains. You know, you had the biggest rail network on the planet in the USA. We need more of those lines reopened. We need Amtrak repairing and maintaining those tracks and opening more lines and having. There are beautiful Union stations in the center of many big metropolitan areas that see 2 or 3 trains a week. What are you doing? Run more trains, produce maps, get people back on the trains, please.
So we have no more questions in the chat as of now, but I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
So how many map t-shirts do you own? Curious. We sell so many. I own 2, so I don't
Map
know.
t-shirts. I've definitely got about 4. I've got quite a few mugs, and as you can see from my set that I made for you, I've got all sorts of other memorabilia. There's the New York destination blinds there on the side, and a whole garage of enamel signs from all over the world. And yeah, I don't steal them, by the way. I don't go around with my screwdriver taking them off the wall. This is being recorded.
Does someone just ask, is there a good example of an iconic bus map?
Good question. There used to be a lot more nice bus maps in the olden days. I do know that some cities are really trying to do that thing of encouraging people. I think there's the city by the lakes, Lucerne, Geneva. Geneva do an integrated metro and bus map, and it's really simple to use. Luxembourg, the whole country, it's quite a small country, obviously, but they show everything together on one map. London bus maps are quite good. I don't remember seeing one from New York City. Tell me what the bus maps are like there, maybe.
They're always vertical. I find them a little confusing. They're definitely diagrammatic, if that's the word that you would use, but it's kind of just like a line and it kind of can shift and move depending on blocks. Yeah, they also are segregated by borough, as someone mentioned.
I wonder if, am I allowed to ask the audience a question?
Sure.
Are there any budding designers in amongst our audience here at all, please? And what kind of maps would you like to design?
Well, while we're waiting on that, I'll ask the very last question, and then I'll let you know if there's any responses. Which was another one of my questions. What's your favorite map?
I find that so difficult to answer because there are so many that I love, really so many that I love. I really love the Barcelona metro map. We saw a little thumbnail of that one at the beginning, and it's a hybrid. So you've got streets on it. The key streets are on it as well. It's a diagram, and it's really, really easy to use. It's recently been redesigned by our friend Jug Serovic. It's just a small little map, but it's so simple, and it really does a good job. So let's put that one up as my favorite.
Okay, great. No, so we didn't have any, we have some people interested in designing bus maps in college towns. There's someone who likes design maps. It's not overly dependent on color, so it's colorblind friendly, which is great. Not a designer, but love maps of city amenities in cities. Most recently, they just added the NYC bathroom map, which is kind of great, but now it's just like hundreds of little tiny toilet. I'm not on the subway map, but on Google Maps, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, so those are the answers to your question. I'm sure there's some who are in programs who maybe didn't participate in the chat, but would have so much inspiration from this wonderful presentation. So I really wanted to thank you, Mark. That was fascinating and so enjoyable. And I want to thank you all for coming today and having such amazing questions. We'd love to see you at the museum if you're in town. If you enjoyed the program, please consider going on our website, becoming a member, or making a donation. And we hope to see you at a future program. So have a great rest of your day.